Okay, hello everyone, and a warm welcome to today's research seminar, where Jason Tucker, who is a researcher here at the Institute and an adjunct associate professor at the Department of Computing Science in Umeå. He holds a PhD in social and policy sciences from the University of Bath. His dissertation from 2014, Challenging the Tyranny of Citizenship, Statelessness in Lebanon, received the UN Refugee Agency Award for Outstanding PhD Research in the field of statelessness. After completing the doctorate, he worked at the UN Refugee Agency from 2014 to 2016. So Jason's research examines the societal and political implications of the artificial intelligence, focusing on transparency, participation, and the public good. Today, Jason will talk about why we need to talk about the global politics of AI and healthcare. Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming and taking the time out of your day. This is the topic of conversation. I'm going to discuss some research that's been going on for several years and argue why we need to really sort of focus a lot on, or a little bit at least, on the global politics behind artificial intelligence in healthcare, why this is important and what it means for our societies and very importantly, the future of healthcare. So I'm going to start today by talking about someone I would rather not talk about, Tony Blair. You're probably thinking someone else, but Tony Blair is still on the radar in British politics, unfortunately. And when you're working in global politics, especially now, you constantly have to change the cases you use to introduce presentations. And this is something that came up in September 24th this year. There was an expose on the Tony Blair Institute. So for those of you that don't know, the Tony Blair Institute is this massive think tank in the UK. It's incredibly influential, especially internationally in international development and peace building, as well as with the Labour government in the UK as well. And it's all built around Tony Blair's brand from his consultancy Post Office. And what this expose from the Lighthouse reports and the New Statesman showed was that there's been some interesting funding going into the Tony Blair Institute. So previously they worked a lot on international development, but sort of 2017, they started pivoting incredibly hard to pro-tech and pro-AI approaches. And just to put this in context, this think tank is now sort of 10 times bigger than anything else we have in the UK. They have 900 staff in 45 countries. They're incredibly influential. And this money was coming from Larry Ellison, who's the foundation of Larry Ellison, which is the head of the Oracle, this huge tech company which has a lot of work does a lot of work in healthcare, but also anything to do with big data, data storage, incredibly wealthy and influential in Silicon Valley, sort of this like senior figure there, and very much benefited from the AI hype we've been going through recently. And what was happening was that the report was showing that the staff within the Tony Blair Institute were largely mouthpieces of Oracle, so selling Oracle products to most explicitly to foreign governments, cheap prices to start, hiking them up, but also in the UK as well. Tony Blair's been sort of whispering in the ear of the Labour government to try and the civil service to try and encourage them to take up Oracle products. And what interested me here the most was that the NHS data sets were so prominent in a lot of the conversations having. So the National Health Service in the UK has this incredible database from 1948 because it's a point of access. So anyone who turns up gets free healthcare, pretty much, but should do at least. So there's a huge amount of health data on nearly all of the population for a huge amount of time. And with AI, because it's the sort of current data-hungry models want as much data as possible. Data sets like this are incredibly rare. This NHS data set itself is unique in liberal democracies. There's a similar thing in the US with a veterans data set because it's sort of free access, but that's a very small part of the population. So Larry Ellison is trying to get Oracle's hands on this data set, and this is what Tony Blair's been pushing. So when we read this, this is why I think it's incredibly important that we talk about the global politics of healthcare and artificial intelligence. We're sort of told repeatedly that AI is going to improve areas of health, and it will, and it has. But there's a lot else going on behind the scenes that we need to pay attention to. So today, I'm going to start by framing AI. I'm going to draw sort of narrow frame about it, but maybe discuss some of the competing ideas about this because it's a hotly contested topic. The problem, why I sort of focus on this, the project and a sub-project of this, which will actually be the focus, some of the findings, and then a short sort of research agenda for the future. So it's not one paper, which I know is traditional in this setting, but it's a sort of collection of work I've been doing for many years, as well as borrowing heavily from other more intelligent scholars as well to sort of start pulling together a framework for how we can sort of understand these sort of complex geopolitical maneuverings when it comes to AI and healthcare. So let's get the slightly controversial part out of the way first. Defining AI is a nightmare because there's a lot of people trying to claim epistemic authority in this area, especially at sort of a global level. So sort of OECD and the EU, everyone's sort of trying to claim different definitions, as well as we have sort of heavy lobbying from interested parties, should we say, because the definition matters when it comes to regulation. But to make things a little bit easier, we can use the World Health Organization definition from 2023, which is that AI is a branch of computer science, statistics, and engineering that uses algorithms or models to perform tasks and exhibit behaviors such as learning, making decisions, and making predictions. And another way to sort of think about this is the OECD definition, which is very much sort of there's inputs, there's outputs, there's sort of a decision-making process within this, and there's an impact on the world. And there's different levels of adaptability and autonomy within this. But this changes over time. And this is because AI is not one thing, as is commonly sort of portrayed in the media, or sort of there's a lack of nuance in the media or public discourse. It's a family of technologies, and I would say a deeply unhappy family of technologies. And understanding why it's so unhappy actually impacts the choices we have today about the future of our healthcare. So this is just a very sort of simplified version of the different strands of AI. They sort of interconnect, they sort of piece together at certain points. But generally, this branch at the top with machine learning is the sort of dominant area that we're talking about now. So these are very data hungry, large amounts of data, big computational capacity, finding patterns in huge data sets. And within this, we have deep learning, which is a sort of very prominent field at the moment, which is where sort of ChatGPT sort of comes from. This is the foundation of it. But there are many other different types, and over time, we've seen different fields having their heyday. Sorry for my graph, but this is just to show the sort of AI summers and winters that you may hear about. So now we're in this AI boom, but this has happened before, not to the same extent by any means. But over time, since like the mid-50s, we've seen AI sort of going up and down. And what you generally see is with these subfields, all think that they can create artificial intelligence. They think that they're right, and they think that the others are wrong and are a waste of money. So they're sort of fighting internally for limited resources all of the time. And currently sort of the machine learning, deep learning crew have all of the money resources largely. So they'll sort of ridicule the others. And this has happened from sort of expert systems before. So it's not like when we talk about AI in healthcare, there's a sort of broad range of tools and techniques that we can use to solve societal problems, because all of these things are good and bad at specific things. We are very much sort of limited in the tools available, because now many of these fields are seeing sort of reduced funding and reduced access to markets, for example. So this is why it's an unhappy family. And then we also have the narrow versus artificial general intelligence. So narrow artificial intelligence are the things that we have now. So like Google Translate, for example, you pop Swedish in and out comes Portuguese. That's a sort of narrow definition, or using sort of GPS. You want to get from A to B, and it tells you the best route, and it looks at traffic and things. Artificial general intelligence generally is this idea that it's intelligence that's better than humans in a range of areas, some say economically viable areas, and then you can sort of slip into super intelligence, so this like artificial intelligence that's more intelligent than us at everything. And this doesn't exist, and there's lots of debate about whether this should or shouldn't happen, and whether we should even be trying together. Some people in this room do some sort of fantastic work on that. So I won't touch on it too much, but we need to talk about artificial general intelligence sometimes, because it's used as a way to sell artificial intelligence in healthcare, sort of the narrow definitions. So the problem. The problem is that healthcare matters a lot. Like if we're sick, it sort of consumes us. If our loved ones are sick, it consumes us. It's very sort of personal and it matters. And during those moments when we need healthcare, we interact with the state in ways that we otherwise wouldn't. So healthcare is sort of different from other areas like education with interaction, assuming it's sort of a public health service, because we have to engage with this institution. And if we receive poor care or there's no care or the public health is mismanaged, it causes huge societal problems. At COVID, we saw this. Even very authoritarian states lost control over populations because of misinformation and poor management of public health. And it matters for democracy. We need to be healthy to interact well within democracies and best within democracies. And also, healthcare is always used as a sort of a key talking point politically about sort of, we can improve your healthcare, we can better your healthcare. The previous party was terrible at providing healthcare. So it matters a lot more than I think we recognize within politics. We're also seeing an incredibly fast-changing global political economy of AI and health, and this is meaning it's kind of difficult to make sure that we're managing or seeing where this is going, because we're interested in the future of our healthcare and AI's role in that, or where it shouldn't be used. And this is why it matters to understand this very sort of opaque political economy of healthcare and these sort of transnational power relations. So a lot of the traditional healthcare providers are sort of being pushed out by non-traditional actors. So Google from sort of 2017 pivoted strongly. So Alphabet, sort of the parent of Google, Apple, Meta, Microsoft, these companies now work very, very much in healthcare, huge amounts of money, and they're sort of dwarfing the sort of traditional big pharma companies in terms of funding and research. And they have other motivations. Google, for example, doesn't just work on healthcare. It collects sort of data and provides services across a range of societal functions. And the same as sort of Microsoft, we sort of use it in our daily lives for many different things. And this matters because of the way this data is sort of collected and used. So healthcare data or healthcare is just sort of another piece of sort of behavioral data to collect for these organizations, another area to sell predictive services, which isn't necessarily... It doesn't necessarily have to be that bad, but there are significant problems with this. There's also technological lock-in and dependency. I mean, we know this. Some of us buy a phone contract and end up with it for sort of 10 years because we just can't be bothered to change it. And within healthcare, this is a problem, these legacy systems. The technology we put into place, we generally get stuck with for a long period of time because it's expensive to change it and people just don't like change. And you also get these new dependencies. So the Danes are a good example here, how they've sort of pushed back against sort of Microsoft services and said actually across like a range of their state functions, they want to create sort of a Danish technological stack. They want local solutions to move away from Microsoft and to sort of break free of this dependency. And if you think about how dependent we are on just say cloud services, sort of American cloud services in Europe, it's actually kind of terrifying. We have very little control. We're sort of very dependent on a few big US tech companies in the hope that they don't just turn off sort of cloud infrastructure. On top of this, there's a lack of, there's an emerging global governance on AI, but it's a lack of sort of specific healthcare related focus here. This is changing and I'll discuss it. It's not the Wild West, but there's definitely a sort of a frontier mentality with sort of working into this like lawless realm from some of these new non-traditional actors. And Gary Marcus has talked about this, how the solutions were being provided very much sort of align with sort of these big tech companies' business models and their areas of interest. And Narayahan and Kapoor in Snake Oil talk about how we should also be a little bit careful that this is just a normal technology. It's not anything particularly special. It's sort of the hottest thing at the moment, but implementing these technologies is slow, it's clunky, it takes time. We know this when we sort of have systems changed at work, for example. It takes a lot of effort and time to bring everyone on board, and there's always some people left behind. And when you're trying to do this at like a healthcare level, it's another sort of another challenge. So this is what my research focuses on, this relationship between artificial intelligence, health, and the global politics. And I do so coming from the perspective that I think evidence-based research can support the policymaking in the government. So I'm working towards sort of a social good, sort of a future of healthcare where AI serves as a social good and isn't just like broadly applied everywhere, or we waste a lot of money now on valuable resources. And just a sort of small caveat, I say health here, but I move between health at an individual level to sort of public health at a public level, because that's how the sort of political economy operates. That some of my research is focused on the sort of individual interactions with the technology, and some of it is sort of the policy level and the international policy level as well. So I sort of mix these terms together. So my project, and I'm very aware that the director of WASP-OS is sat in the room looking at me. So my project is funded by WASP-OS, and it started in 2021 and goes on 2027, and moved to the institute in 2024. And this is part of a broad sort of a Swedish research group where we're looking at the humanity and social sciences side of artificial intelligence within society. And it may be sort of a smaller organization as compared to sort of WASP and the other bigger research groups, but it's sort of vital because we're looking at how, if, and where, and who should implement AI across society. And it's part of this project, which has been very refreshing, is that it's allowed us to take risks with the research we're doing. So we're trying to look at sort of, for example, the politics of AI in healthcare. It's a massive area, and when you sort of go into this research, it's difficult to know what will end up. Like during this research project, ChatGPT came out. Okay, so this is just to put it in context. This technology does move fast, and we need to sort of adapt as well. And one of the things that's come out of this in late 2024. So I've been working on this for sort of 3 years and publishing and doing research and trying to sort of grapple with what's going on, pulling different strands together. And it was messy. Like I was struggling to see how I'd present something like this. And in 2024, the British Academy released a call for papers, part of their global disorder campaign, where they're trying to support policymakers to navigate the global political changes in this disorder. And I thought this is a good way for me to force myself to sit and compile all of this information and draw on my work and others' work to provide a 4,000 or 5,000 word report to policymakers on this. And this will come out in November. So this is what I'm going to focus on, the findings from this. And this is why I don't talk about sort of individual piece of research, because it collects a range of my work. And it's a good point because it's sort of in the middle of my project. So I'll also talk a little bit about the future of the work afterwards. And I'm aware that 20 odd minutes left. There's no way I can get through all of the different sections of this. And I don't intend to. I'll spare you from that. But I'm going to pick a few of them which I think are particularly sort of important to discuss, and we can discuss the others as well. Sort of the geopolitics of health data is just such a minefield that that could be a day's sort of presentation on its own. And I go through these quite lightly because it's meant for sort of policymakers, but we can obviously discuss it in much more depth afterwards. So the first problem I had when I talk about AI in healthcare at a range of levels is people say, well, what are we talking about? Are we talking about individual health, sort of public health? What are these narratives? Like, what purpose do they serve? What are the discourses play? So I tried to put together a tool to allow policymakers, when we're discussing this, to think, okay, when we hear narratives about artificial intelligence in healthcare, at what sort of level are they and what's their purpose? So at the top, we have advancing broader political agendas using AI in healthcare. So here, healthcare is very much, healthcare and even AI is very much instrumentalized to serve other political purposes. A good example is the European Commission a few days ago released yet another AI first policy, where AI is going to be thrown at sort of a range of societal options, and we should use AI first in all areas of public services and across society. And this is an industrial policy that the European Commission has been pushing for quite a while to sort of free up money and build momentum in this sort of vain hope of winning an AI race. And healthcare, if we look at the European Commission press releases and their policy reports, healthcare comes up almost always in the first sentence as the primary area where we're going to have societal benefits. So we need to do this because it'll improve healthcare and the sort of innovative and sort of economic development as well. So here AI is constantly used as a way to sell this to the public. And it's not really about healthcare. If you want to improve healthcare, you can sort of invest in healthcare, which may include AI research as well. And another example is OpenAI released a new model a few months ago, and they brought on a cancer survivor who talked about her journey and how she'd used the previous version of ChatGPT to support her where clinicians weren't able to diagnose her cancer, and she sort of engaged with this tool to help her process this information, but also critique the clinicians and get sort of information to sort of push to get the diagnosis that eventually was the one that she needed. And here we see sort of strong links to the artificial general intelligence in the future could potentially cure cancer. So we sort of need to get out of the way and let these industry hyperscalers, the sort of huge big tech companies who sort of collect data and process over patterns, get out of their way and let them do what they want, because there's a chance they can get to artificial general intelligence, which could cure cancer. So here it is very much this sort of AI first approach of just sort of deregulation. Give us all your data, trust us, we'll like make society better. That comes from Silicon Valley, this narrative. And this shapes below. So these technological promises are what states and international organizations, sort of this policy level, when we talk about the future of healthcare and the role of artificial intelligence by this is shaped by this narrative. The Swedish state can't sort of push back too heavily against OpenAI and Google and Apple, for example. Like they're very dominant actors, so what they say sort of goes. But they do have a lot of influence over what actually happens on the ground. So what's funded, the sort of current applications of AI in healthcare. And here, these technological promises are the way that states, socio-technical imaginaries, Jasnov's work are used here to look at national AI strategies across the Nordics, but also global governance on AI and healthcare from sort of World Health Organization, these organizations. And what we see is there's a very strong alignment of techno-solutionism that AI is going to be beneficial for healthcare. It's inevitable, it's going to happen, but we still need to deregulate despite the inevitability, which always confuses me a little bit. And it's going to be overwhelmingly beneficial, but this is only in areas where it comes to the efficiency. It's very difficult to point to other areas where it's going to be useful. At a state level, we see that this is used to justify past and current policies. So in Sweden, for example, image analysis is a sort of a big area where there's sort of a chance that sort of Sweden has sort of dominance internationally when it comes to identifying cancer, etc. So this is pushed in the sort of the Swedish level, but generally these promises. What happens is states claim that the private sector is the only people that can realize these visions, so we have to sort of give control over to them, and they sort of become unable to drive these promises. They're sort of promising things they don't really have that much control over. So the EU promising that AI can fix healthcare, or the European Commission, sorry, they hope it can make sort of radical improvements in healthcare. I'm sure that that's what they desire, but they have very little control over this because of the nature of innovation of AI, but also because we're focusing on very specific areas of artificial intelligence, sort of deep learning, sort of big data approaches, which have limitations in what they can achieve. So, and this also reduces not only the areas of AI we could talk about, but non-AI solutions. So if you want to talk about resolving cancer, yes, we could go for this like artificial general intelligence, hyperscalers, and then hope that this fixes it. Or we could do more of the same when it comes to public health interventions, reduce smoking, better diet, better exercise, less stress, these sort of things. Proven techniques that massively decrease cancer. So non-technical solutions are taken off the table. It's just like we have to choose which of the AI tools we should implement. And then the bottom, these are the very sort of specific applications. So these are very much narrowed by what happens at this level. And this is what happens in hospitals or sort of chatbots we use, sort of not just in sort of public health, but a range of applications at this level. So we can talk about like the nuance of the context of how they're applied, etc. So I hope that helps a bit. I'm still working on that to narrow it down. But this is sort of where it sort of comes. The sort of major problems come out, and this is the global political economy. And I'm going to try and do this in one slide, which is a tad ambitious, which is why I've got these diagrams, because I think they nicely reflect the complexity of the system and how difficult it is to identify the key players and what's going on. So here we have what's called the tech stack. So the AI is at the top of this stack because that's what we're focusing on. And when we talk about artificial intelligence, we generally sit at this level. We have ChatGPT, it's on our computers, it's on our phones. That's sort of all we look into. But what we actually have underneath this is a sort of very complicated web of underneath you sort of have software, cloud computing, like how the data is stored, the Internet of Things and devices like your phones, watches, all the stuff that collects data, networks, how this all connects to each other, chips like the semiconductors, which have become an obsession of mine. I think it's an incredibly useful way to pick one area of this stack and sort of pull it out and just see what collapses. And then the critical resources, minerals and energy. Like we need water, energy and resources to build this stuff. It's not sort of, it doesn't exist in sort of a cloud. And to add a little bit more sort of context to this, so if we look at this stack, and this was drawn up in response to the EU claiming that they needed digital sovereignty, and many states have claimed that they're going to work towards digital sovereignty, especially those that think they might have a shot with the AI race. Lower middle income countries don't make these claims because they understand how sort of the dependency is on these huge players in the international system. But here we have the key countries and the key firms. So largely this is private sector driven. Data and AI is mostly the US. The Chinese are sort of making some ground, but the US are the big players here. Software is mostly the US. Again, China has some space. Germany's on there, so good for Europe, but a very small player. Cloud computing, again, US dominance. Internet of Things, this is a little bit more sort of diversified, but generally is still US leaning. Semiconductors, these chips, so these are sort of vital for artificial intelligence. You'll see OpenAI and NVIDIA, a big sort of semiconductor company, and they make these, they're called GPUs. So the semiconductors that are very useful for the type of AI which is favored at the moment. And this making semiconductors is incredibly expensive, and it's incredibly difficult because you need to be at the cutting edge all of the time. So you need states to throw money at this problem. And that's why Taiwan, this has been part of their policy, is if they have these factories, so they don't sort of design the chips themselves, they largely, the US have the software, the Dutch make the machines to allow this to happen, but the factories themselves and the expertise are in Taiwan. And this protects them from the Chinese, because if the Chinese, when the Chinese threaten to invade the US and the rest of the world, says, well, if you do that, you're going to collapse the economy, because we need these semiconductors, not just for AI, but for everything, so all technical things. There's like 1,000 chips in a car. I tried to check, but it's difficult for sort of products because for proprietary issues. But I think in my Fitbit watch, there's like 6 and like 20 in a normal iPhone. And we saw when that boat turned on the Suez Canal and blocked it, and it stopped sort of the chips getting through. We saw the impact this has on the economy. And this has been a subject of tension between the US and China. So under the Biden administration, they tried to choke AI innovation in China by saying you can't have access to the best semiconductors. The Chinese responded by becoming better with worse semiconductors and released DeepSeek, this model, and showed that actually you don't need the best semiconductors to do this work, and it was actually less energy intensive. And so the Trump administration has now turned the tap back on and said you can have them, but there's huge taxes on NVIDIA, the company that sells these chips. The Chinese have turned around and said, actually, we don't really want to be reliant on them, so we're going to try and work to find an in-house solution. But also we're going to talk about cutting the rare earth minerals, which are needed to not just for AI, but sort of all of like the US economy, especially sort of the military, relies on this. So you see how just looking at chips, you have this constant sort of battle over supremacy for AI. And then we have to take into consideration all of these other factors. And the Dutch here, the Dutch companies who make these incredibly specialized machines that allow semiconductors have a huge amount of power. They're sort of the only thing we really have in Europe is them. They, without them, we're a little bit sort of vulnerable to the the swings of the US administration, who gets chips and when. And they've actually come out very strongly, these there's ASML in contesting the regulation of AI in Europe, and that we need more innovation and just to sort of throw money at AI. So this is a little bit worrying from an EU perspective as well, that they might not necessarily be aligning with EU values in that sense. So yeah, we have from a healthcare perspective, we have Alphabet, Apple, Meta, and Microsoft, who've massively invested in healthcare, sort of huge players, and they also control pretty much all of this stack. So this is a problem, that our sort of health data is flowing through these different stacks and very reliant on it. So it's not just about healthcare. If say Amazon, who run a lot of cloud computing in Europe, if the European Union sort of picks a fight with them about something other than health, and they threaten the cloud services, this impacts healthcare and education and sort of security and everything. So we're very dependent on some not very dependable actors, and this has been discussed in terms of weaponized interdependence. So this idea that globalization brings us all together, we're not going to fight. The US has been using semiconductors, Chris Miller talked about this, as a way to sort of weaponize interdependence, to make actors comply. So when the Chinese have said we're going to start building our own chips, the US have just cut them off, or they sort of disrupt their chip supplies. So what do we have in place to manage this then? Well, not a lot. The World Health Organization was doing some pretty phenomenal work on this, producing ethical guidelines, as well as guidelines on how AI can be used for different populations or issues like sexual and reproductive health, or AI in the elderly. And they're doing some amazing work implementing soft law and sort of pushing regulation and supporting actors. But then the current administration in the US withdrew for the second time from WHO, and that's cut a lot of their funding and power. And that's a real shame from a healthcare perspective. And these sort of vertical regulations are very useful. At a broader scale, we have the UN has now launched its new interdisciplinary international scientific panel on AI, and a global dialogue on AI, which could be spaces to discuss healthcare. But the thing that's most important here is the EU AI Act. So healthcare here is noted as a high-risk area, so there's greater demands on model transparency, data quality, these sort of things. And because there's not really a global standard at the moment, there's a chance that this becomes a sort of de facto global governance sort of standard on AI in healthcare, because access to the EU market is pretty useful. Also, the Europeans have now put this European health data center together, so we sort of pulled all the health data into one place, and access to that is going to require compliance with the EU AI Act. We also have standards being set. So I think I have a colleague in Lund who says standards, no one looks at them because they're really boring, but they're actually and he works on standards, but they're actually incredibly impactful. So how standards are set about the sort of technical side is very meaningful in how these laws and governance mechanisms play out. And there's some excellent work being done in this group on these standards as well. This is generally sort of an undemocratic space where huge amounts of power is wielded. And from that sense, I think it's definitely worth sort of more attention. I think this is where we're going to see the sort of the real sort of fight over the governance of AI in healthcare. And then at a state level, we have the South Koreans have this horizontal governance about AI in general, but healthcare is also included in that. And within states, we have AI is incredibly well regulated in most states, and rightly so, because before we had this sort of snake oil approach where everyone could sell whatever the hell they wanted. So when we have this argument that we should reduce regulation of AI because it'll improve healthcare, this very much butts against the tradition we have in healthcare. And this is why we can go to the pharmacy and buy paracetamol in Paris or Malmö or Stockholm, and we know that it's generally the same thing. We trust what's in there, and that it's going to reduce our headache. We have a lot of trust in the health service because of this crazy amount of regulation. And at the same time, we have Zuboff's work here on surveillance capitalism highlights how the big tech companies do not like this regulation because they thrive in this lawless realm. That's where they sort of collect data and keep pushing, because the AI companies, the big ones, keep adding market value by collecting more and more and more and more data. This is so vital to them. And Karen Howell's recent work on the dreams and promises of Sam Altman's OpenAI is very interesting here, because it talks about how OpenAI has this sort of empire approach to how it operates as well, internationally as well as sort of within the US, which I think is fascinating. Security and conflicts actually one that I didn't really think was going to come up, and when it did, it gave me the most sleepless nights when it comes to health. So yes, we will have medical advances in healthcare, but using more AI in health in such a fragmented way, which is what's happening now, leaves healthcare systems very, very open to attack. And this has been documented in certain ways, sort of this AI misinformation during the COVID pandemic, how AI was used to spread sort of public health misinformation about public health and cause dissent. But this barrage of cyber attacks and hybrid warfare that healthcare services are facing is something we don't talk about. And Mariette Schack talks about this in her book, The Tech Coup, of how there's this sort of digital exceptionalism, that when states and non-state actors are attacking digital services, it's just part of the game. It's part of the AI race. We'll accept it. Something that just wouldn't happen if, say, Russia were to sabotage a hospital in real life. That would be considered a sort of act of war. And these are growing massively. So in 2021, the World Health Organization sent out a survey globally, and a third of those that responded, this was to healthcare providers, a third of those respondents said they faced a ransomware attack in the last year, at least one, and a third of those paid out. So the money being paid to sort of criminal gangs, state and non-state aligned, is massive from the healthcare sector. And the UN warned that the critical sector in the EU, which faces the most cyber attacks, is healthcare now. So it's sort of been barraged by nefarious actors. And we saw this in Ukraine as well, that before the Russian full-scale invasion, they identified lots of zero-day gaps, so ways to sort of collapse the system. And instead of using them when they found them, they waited, and then just before the invasion, they collapsed the digital state, including healthcare. So if we have lots of people applying healthcare in a fragmented way across society without, and it's in no way their fault, very little understanding of security and how this affects national security, this is a massive problem for everyone, because it means that we're incredibly sort of vulnerable, and there's very little resilience in the system. The more we rely on AI, the more that we have problems when it gets taken down. I'll move forward slightly faster. When it comes to the geopolitical risks and limitations, AI will not revolutionize healthcare. AI will improve some areas of health for some people. We just have to figure out the trade-offs, because often there's a cost that has to be paid by someone else. And this isn't necessarily just not having access to service, but there's negative health externalities of AI as well. Because AI exists in the real world. It's sort of mind, it's physical. People have to train the data. It exists. And this is a map of the data centers. So this is just to show that even if we do sort of make substantial advances in AI and healthcare, there's not equal access. So it's very useful to be close to a data center, not so close that you're affected by the pollution and the noise, but it's very close to have a data center close to you, because it means you can get access to data quicker. These are just the biggest ones, and I'm sorry, it's not very clear. And you can see there's a high concentration in the US and Europe and China to a certain extent. And then the tiny cables that you definitely can't see. There's a lot of sort of subsea data cables. There's a huge amount of infrastructure, and these are very costly to lay them. In the Nordics, we know these have also been the subject of sabotage. But this matters, because where these are means that you need these to build the data centers and to move data. So most of our data moves through these cables under the sea, and these are largely private owned. Google and Meta have been very sort of pushy in developing these. And this is just to show that the infrastructure in place to support the equal access to AI and healthcare is just not there. There's also problems that if AI is made for populations it's not meant for, it doesn't work so well. There's bias, there's discrimination, there's a lack of transparency. There's a whole range of issues that we need to consider to make sure that it works well for populations. And this generally means that maybe we can't use a sort of one-size-fits-all approach to using these solutions. A tool made in Sweden is not going to work so well in Rwanda, for example, and certain populations, because different contexts and different sort of needs of the population, the data needs to be different to accommodate those. There's also a danger here that AI is being seen as a solution and it ignores the upstream problems, like why are certain populations unhealthy than others? And then we have sort of discrimination and bias and these sort of things at a societal level. And AI is a way to sort of wipe over that and say, but we could just put AI on top. So I touched a little bit on the environmental impacts, but I think we need to reinforce them a little bit more, that not all AI models are equally bad for the environment. You know, it's like many things. There's a range of models that could be used at a range of scales. And healthcare is has an incredible environmental impact because it's such a huge thing, sort of public healthcare and the healthcare industry. So AI can be used to reduce, say, carbon emissions within this. There's sort of positive sides. But AI models in healthcare generally generate a lot of environmental impacts. They're big, they require lots of data and energy, and they need constant sort of updating. And the research of Kate Crawford's work here is showing how this is the impacts of this, where the sort of data centers are, who mines the rare earth minerals, generally disproportionately affect marginalized groups locally, and then globally. AI now showed that the regional distribution of AI's environmental impacts mirrors historical practices of settler colonialism. So it's sort of reinforcing power relations at a local and sort of global level as well, with who pays the cost for this. And it's true that those that will benefit most from AI in healthcare, those that probably don't need the most the benefits. Those that need it the most will not receive it, based on sort of how we're going at the moment. So to summarize, there's the global politics of AI in healthcare is very much narrowing the options we have in terms of not only what types of AI we can use in healthcare, but also non-technical solutions. If we throw all of our eggs in the basket that AI is going to fix everything, we're taking money, resources, and time away from other solutions as well. There's a lot of tech lock-in, which is a problem. We sort of buy into a tool, we're stuck with it, which I think now is interesting with the EU's going all in for the AI race at a time when many, sort of the Bank of England are talking about an AI bubble. It seems odd to go all in at this time. Weaponized interdependence and regulatory capture. These come up a lot with the big tech companies. There's also this problem that we talk about an AI race constantly, but when it comes to global health, there's definitely a very reasonable case for collaboration, not competition. If all sort of states are working towards areas where there's a sort of business case, that may not necessarily be in line with sort of public health or global health needs. So there's a need to sort of collaborate and divide up the problems we have and focus on different areas. The US hegemony doesn't help in this, and the instrumentalization of healthcare in AI policy and the use of AI as a way, I mean, AI is used as the geopolitical rivalry is used as a way to advance AI investments. Sort of, we have to beat China in the US. We have to beat China. Keep investing in the AI. Because of healthcare's role in this, it's increasingly on like the front line of this battle. There's also, and my final point is, there's very limited space for public participation because we feel like we can't have these conversations. There's huge companies who very much control the narrative and the discourse, and we can't discuss things like, should we actually use AI in every area of healthcare? What areas can we use it? And where is it just not acceptable? Where we'd like to focus? Maybe there's rare forms of childhood cancer that we're actually willing to take a huge economic hit because there's a chance we can resolve, we can find a solution. So this is just a bit of work coming out in the next few months on this and some events, but I'll not go through that because I've taken up my time, and then the references obviously come.
Thank you so much, Jason. So now it's time for Q&A, and you raise full hands if you want to raise a question, and a finger if you want to comment on the previous. Keep your hands up. Marcus.
Okay, thanks. I guess I have two questions, but I could start with one and then return later. This is really interesting for the presentation. So I was wondering if you could say something more about what's actually being done in AI and healthcare, because that's often obfuscated by the rhetoric here. And so just for to give some background, I think the authors of the snake oil book that you referenced, they mentioned that talk about AI right now is almost like talking about transportation as a concept. We use AI to cover everything that we could essentially use transportation to cover. But if we only talked about transportation, then we would mix up, I don't know, space rockets going to the moon with a bike on the sidewalk of Stockholm.
Yeah.
So we need a more nuanced concept to actually capture what's going on. It seems to me that this explains a lot of the rhetoric around AI and healthcare when people like Sam Altman says that we need to develop AGI because that will solve cancer. I mean, he just released a video generation model that will definitely not cure cancer. So what is he actually doing? But that's just my view of this as a non-expert. So I wonder if you could say more about this with much more knowledge. What is actually going on? And can we use some kind of conceptual apparatus to capture or to distinguish between the kind of business rhetoric and the AGI hype from actual honest efforts to do improvements in healthcare?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this is something I've been wrestling with a lot, and like you say, the problem is that it's presented sort of a general purpose technology that can be dropped down, and medical innovations generally come sort of bottom up. You're not going to create something that fixes everything. It's sort of trying to fix one specific thing. One way I've actually found to cut through the rhetoric a little bit is looking into foresight exercises from respected sort of authorities. So the World Health Organization have been doing this since 2021, and they've sort of collected a group of experts together looking at foresight exercises on emerging technologies in general. And one of the pieces that's coming out hopefully this week or next is on this, the findings. And they ask the experts to say, okay, you can't just say AI is going to fix healthcare. You have to say what specific system, what application, and then rank it in terms of impact, likelihood of being realized, timescale. And once you start doing that, you start seeing that there's actually very few areas of AI innovation that we can sort of predict beyond sort of 5 years, and they're quite sort of narrow. So sort of image analysis, diagnosis is an area where it's seen as like having a massive impact to support clinicians with diagnosis. As well as drug discovery is seen as an area where there's going to be big progress, and maybe sort of cloud laboratories and sort of telemedicine, these sort of areas supporting that. So this is what this is a way that I found sort of access into this. But I also work very closely with clinicians who are sort of developing these tools, and they'll do amazing things. And then when they take this to the public sector, they're sort of trying to make a business case for it, and then it's pushed back as well. So there's also that level about what's sort of acceptable at the bottom, not just sort of the innovation. Yeah, does that answer the question?
Thank you. Valdemar.
Is there time for a super quick follow-up? So the efforts that you just mentioned, are they being driven by the same kind of multinational development companies, or are they coming from academia or collaborations or smaller companies, startups? Where are they geographically located? Okay.
Yeah, so these foresight exercises were largely academics and public health researchers. They weren't allowed to have any conflict of interest with the private actors, which in the AI world is very difficult because most people, like the big tech companies, have been pretty good at sort of funding researchers so this was the problem was there wasn't a huge geographical diversity. There are issues with that. So Latin America, I don't think, was included very well in this group. But yeah, they're mainly sort of public health experts, universities, and World Health Organization, civil society, but without any conflict of interest with big tech companies.
Valdemar.
Thank you, Jason. I'm Valdemar Ringdahl. Very interesting to listen to you. And I was thinking when hearing your presentation, if your research has touched about the geopolitics of moats. There was a lot of discussion in the AI tech business about building moats, how to protect these models. And this year we had a big scare when Chinese DeepSeek was launched and showed that you could develop generative AI, and it wasn't super costly. It was quick to develop. So if your research has seen where these moats are built by the various national or corporate actors. Have you found any such?
I think Zubov's work on surveillance capitalism is really useful here, about how the sort of big US tech companies have built these moats in terms of owning the infrastructure around this. And when we look back to this slide, it's a little bit small, but we can start seeing the same names popping up again in the private actors. So Meta, Google, and Amazon sort of pop up throughout this, and Alibaba, sort of Chinese companies as well. And we can see this a little bit now with OpenAI and sort of Microsoft's collaboration, and NVIDIA sort of connecting themselves to so sort of deeply embedding themselves within other organizations and building like a moat around them that way. But I don't actually see such a problem with sort of DeepSeek coming out. I think isn't this sort of what we're sort of wanting? We're wanting this innovation. If someone can make a model cheaper and it's less energy intensive, yes, there's like the political rhetoric that's involved in this, and the problem with LLMs in general, not just DeepSeek. But there is it's very difficult to like crack into this market. If you're a small startup and you have a good idea, one of the bigger companies is going to take you very quickly. And if you don't sort of align with their position, the project's going to be lost.
Thank you. Now we have a question online. Ellen Svensson.
Yes, hi. Thank you for a really interesting talk. I wanted to ask a bit about the implementation gap for AI in healthcare. So some studies have shown that although AI attracted 6.1 billion in investments, only 12% of those systems actually made it to the clinic. And another study that like 80% of all the AI projects for healthcare basically failed to move beyond the pilot phase. So I was just wondering, seeing these stats, do you think that, like, first of all, what do you think are the causes for this implementation gap? And second, seeing the global politics issue that you bring up, should we be interested in bridging the gap? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the implementation gap is based on sort of traditional legacy problems within the healthcare system. They're sort of slow and clunky, and this is often by design. Like clinicians generally want sort of evidence behind to sort of support making a decision. They don't want to sort of rush into diagnosing someone without sort of sufficient sort of scientific backing. I think the hype cycle around AI is sort of pushing AI to fix a range of healthcare solutions where it's just sort of models are being used, AI systems are being used in areas where they really have no business, especially generative AI. This idea that generative AI can fix the things that's being thrown out is a little bit absurd. It can help in some areas, but it's very high risk. So I think there's sort of traditional factors there. I do agree that maybe this is kind of useful because it's meaning that AI isn't going to be so sort of poorly thought through, and implemented AI systems aren't going to seep into public healthcare systems as much as they could do. But I think the real problem is that that's like huge resource waste, because this isn't private companies coming in and seeing if they can solve a problem. This are clinicians who are sort of being taken off their roles to support sort of validating models and data validation. And lots of public sector is also sort of moving to the private sector to try and solve these problems. And I think this is a massive issue. It's okay if we take high risk strategies to solve some healthcare problems, but there has to be societal support for that. And this is what I think is lacking. We're not sort of discussing, or there's not sort of a space to discuss where we would like AI to be used most in society, in healthcare.
Thanks. Benjamin.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I was wondering if I could ask a bit more for your thoughts on the kind of regulatory framework, specifically around IP law, for example. So the question would be, can we anticipate or expect in any sense that the way that AI would be incorporated into healthcare systems, and maybe on the Internet of Things level in your stack, would be any different than what we're seeing right now? And I was thinking, I don't know if you've been following the kind of rollout of Cory Doctorow's enshittification book, but one of his big examples is that hospital respirators that there's sort of intellectual, like there's a parts pairing prevention where there's like a software that prevents a sort of machine and mask being paired without an unlock code. So you mechanically it's fine, but there's a kind of control that hospitals cannot repair them themselves without a technician. This became a problem during the pandemic because the companies that control these machines couldn't dispatch technicians. So apparently I haven't read the book yet because it's just out, but it's one of the examples that he's using to sort of say that sort of IP is sort of overexerting in a way that's counterproductive for things like healthcare, specifically. And so I was wondering, as we get higher and higher up into these spaces where big tech is sort of coming very, very close to almost being regulated as some sort of public entity, but resist that. If particularly on the EU level, there's any kind of capacity to sort of see some of these things change on a kind of legal basis, not the material basis that you're tracing, but the kind of IP law that has been used, let's say, rather aggressively to assert the sort of asymmetries of control, right? So it seems like OpenAI draws on accessing very large sets of publicly available data or kind of gray areas around copyright, but then the implementation on a device level right now is very much about controlling all of that in a sort of unidirectional way. So I'm wondering if there's some gap here that could be deployed for public good, perhaps, rather than,
Yeah, thank you. So I'm not a lawyer, and I'm aware when I sort of delve into legal questions, lawyers in the room and online will not be particularly happy. But I think it's a really interesting point, and I think it's something to make it even messier. I think we also have the problem between public and non-public sort of data, health data. So, like I talked about before, we have the sort of big public health data sets in the NHS and in sort of Europe, the public health systems. But then we also have this data which we freely give away. So like my watch records my steps, my heart rate, all of this just like goes off to Google and can be used for training their models and to provide me services. So there's this like blurring between the private and the public health data. And I think this is also an area where there needs to be more sort of regulation and discussion. But when it comes to sort of intellectual property, it's something I should definitely explore more. But I think I wouldn't put too much faith in the EU at the moment because of the way they're reacting to the sort of geopolitical fight between the US and China, that they think maybe they have a shot to like, I don't know, get it not in the middle, but maybe sort of start building up the economy based on AI. So they're very much not willing to annoy the big tech companies at the moment. And we see this in sort of going back on sort of legislative promises and the rhetoric. Yeah.
Thanks. Anandi.
Thank you. That was super interesting. I have sort of a background view where I agree with you about the overhyped AGI, the concept of AGI and the way that's overhyped, and this kind of techno-solutionism that's based, I think, on a misconception of what intelligence is and therefore what AGI is. But I was always of the sort of naive view that if you looked carefully at these models, like the machine learning models, and recognized that they're fundamentally statistical data models that don't have their own intelligence or agency or anything like that, then their value would come in exactly places like this. In the use of them as statistical models of large quantities of data to discover patterns that we could never, as humans, identify using statistical techniques that we couldn't devise. And so I'm surprised that this is so problematic in this particular case. And I want to ask you just if you can say a little bit more about what it is, why it is that what's effectively a very sophisticated data model is not having the kind of benefits in healthcare that you would expect. So what is it about the way in which they're being implemented or the way in which they're being used that explains why they're not living up to their promise, even in this very narrow domain? Yeah,
I agree. I think, it's an incredible, some of these like AI systems are incredible technology and they can be applied very well in certain areas. I think part of the problem is that there's just throwing generative AI at everything. But even where you have models being used in a place where they actually could do a lot of good, there's issues of you can't overcome the fact that the data that's being collected discriminates against everyone who's pretty much not like a white man in most societies in Europe. So you have this huge massive of bias in data and discriminations of the algorithms and how it's designed. And these are problems. If it's sort of statistical predictions based on past data, it's going to reinforce those stereotypes going forward unless it's very carefully managed. And that's difficult with such big data sets. And it's even more complicated where there's sort of this black box problem where you can't identify how the AI system came to the decision it did. And in some areas, it may be worth the risk as long as there's like, agreement within sort of society that there's this scenario where we can sort of take this risk. But in areas of healthcare, there's a problem because clinicians are the ones who are responsible. So with sort of ChatGPT, when you use it in like the office, no one really cares and no one's really responsible. Maybe you, if you're like a lawyer, and send it off to someone else. But with generative AI and sort of AI in general in the healthcare setting, the clinician is the one who's responsible, and they're the one who has to sort of understand the system and tell the patient. And I think that's a big problem that's where they push back. It's like if it's an untransparent system, you've got to have a lot of trust in the people that made it to trust that it's a system that you're willing to sort of rely on in some life and death situations. So I'm not saying it's not good in all situations, but I think we have to think about the quality of the data, the bias of the data, who benefits from this, and then the environmental impact. There's lots of sort of trade-offs like with everything, and I think we can and do use it in various areas of health very successfully.
Can I ask a follow-up? So I wonder, so I can see how these issues crop up in clinical contexts, but I'm wondering about the use of generative models in the analysis of data in more sort of research, fundamental research contexts. So like AlphaFold, for example, which wasn't really directly being used in a clinical context, but can ultimately be used in drug discovery and in ways that would have benefits for health, but just not directly in this kind of clinical setting. And so I'm wondering if there's more success in that kind of use of generative models, if the problems come up more in the kind of human interface areas where we're actually dealing with making decisions about how to treat particular individuals, or whether you see similar problems coming up even in the sort of pure research contexts of those uses.
Yeah, I think it's this here like deep learning, not specifically sort of generative AI is really useful in these sort of situations, sort of AlphaFold. And it's difficult to say because a lot of these sort of drug discovery is done privately and they don't talk about the failures, just generally talk about the successes. But I think there's like an incredibly valuable tool, and especially the sort of lower risk of harming patients. And there's a good business case for them to try and make sure the data is like clean and it does what it's supposed to do. So I think in these sort of cases, I don't have a problem with AI being used in general, but I think we need to use it sort of very strategically. And very, very carefully, like everything in healthcare.
Thanks. Pontus.
Hi, thank you. So I have a weird question. So when we look at the norms of AI developers in Silicon Valley, we find that they are very individualistic in the sense that they're focused on the individual. And when you hear them talking about healthcare, it's a lot about how AI will make it able to make a specific medicine for one person. It's a lot of focus on how they can give individualized solution. And my assumption is that policymakers tend to instead have views that are about collective solutions, because they have to think about stuff like where should hospitals be for where people are living and so on. So my question is, to what extent do you see that this creates a problem when they're trying to communicate, that they have different viewpoints on what is solutions to the world? Is it that we find something good for each individual, or do we actually need structural things?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this is a massive point of tension. So you're right. These sort of the models are developed on this sort of individual, this notion of the individual, and when it comes to healthcare, this is sort of why Western biomedical sort of reductionist approach that like I'm an individual. There's no sort of cultural or contextual issues that impact my health. I can sort of improve or worsen my health through like choices I make, and this comes across very strongly in the AI systems that are sort of being rolled out. And like you say, this butts up against very strongly with many public health professionals who have this bigger sort of pitch about where we should implement these solutions and for bigger populations. What I'm seeing is that precision medicine is being sold, also being used as a way to advance the policies on AI in healthcare by even those who should be sort of upholding public health funding. And this is a massive problem because you're shifting the responsibility to the individual. You're promising precision medicine and precision sort of healthcare, which is very, very problematic to achieve and also very difficult to manage. Like how, if we're both getting precision medicine, how do we know that one of us isn't being discriminated against or sort of receiving equal access? And it's very difficult.
And how do we handle vaccines?
Yeah, I mean, it's not sort of from a public health perspective, it's just not useful. And also efficiency isn't sort of the public healthcare, optimization isn't the public healthcare's driving force. It's sort of public health, including the inefficiencies, the people in society that we want to look after, even though there's sort of extra cost in doing so. So yeah, this is a massive tension and one that I actually need to explore more in the policy because it's always sort of coming up. But yeah, thanks.
Karim.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, this was really interesting. So I had a question about your thoughts on an aspect of the kind of innovation discourse that I noted, and I think that there seems to be an overemphasis on innovation and an underestimate of adoption. Of course, innovation is very important. But if we care about results, if we care about improved health or improved productivity, what matters is ultimately that these systems, that useful technologies end up being used. And of course, if you have a strong innovation cluster, then that can generate lots of profits and maybe facilitate adoption to some extent. But that's not at all necessary. I mean, as an example, you have thorium nuclear power that was invented in the United States, but China is adopting the technology. Or high-speed rail is also invented in the United States, but China is building it. So how does that kind of dichotomy or like tension between the debate and what the research says figure out in your picture of like geopolitics?
Thanks. Yeah. So I didn't talk so much about the work I've been doing on the sort of national and international policy document. I do a lot of the policy analysis, and this is something that comes up all the time, that it very much follows this innovation is good, innovation will solve our problems, but then adoption is seen as the stumbling point. And the way that the sort of World Health Organization or sort of state actors, there's a lot of alignment that the way that we reduce this is take out regulation, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. Like I agree, like the adoption is the problem, and with healthcare it's even more important because of this interaction we have with the state. So if we are promised better access to primary care through AI, through chatbots, and we use these chatbots and they're not good, and they get taken down, and then the waiting times don't sort of get better, we can sort of quantify this very quickly as well. So this adoption into healthcare, we see it. It's not like other areas like the military where AI is being adopted, but it doesn't really like affect us. We can't really see it until maybe in a time when we don't want to see it. But yeah, that's definitely adoption is seen as the healthcare systems are placed as the problem. The legacy systems are the problem. The staff not taking this up are the problem, and the innovation should just happen and then like drop tech down on society.
Marcus.
Okay, so another question from me then, and it relates to Karim's point, I think. So it was interesting that you mentioned Larry Ellison at the top of the talk of Oracle, because I was thinking about the example of the Millennium system in Swedish healthcare, which was, I guess, developed by Oracle, right?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it was. So I won't recap everything that happened with the Millennium system, but it the debacle that it created illustrates a few things that I think are important here. So, and you also touched on this in your talk. So I guess different kinds of technical healthcare systems are often developed by multinational companies like Oracle. It's difficult to develop them locally, although you mentioned Denmark, and I would be curious to hear more about this, because it's very resource intensive and so forth. So I guess there is a temptation from the public sector to go to turn to multinational companies when trying to procure these kinds of systems instead of developing them on your own. On the other hand, you also mentioned that you need the kind of local data or understanding of the local circumstances, both in order to implement the system, I guess, relating to Karim's point, and also to develop the system such that it works for your population. So there's a tension here, I guess, between what actually works, which requires attention to local details, and what's actually being offered, which is most often a much more global solution or universal solution or whatever. And this raises interesting questions about how best to proceed with these kinds of policies, and also about the power relations between public sectors in specific jurisdictions and these multinational powerful companies. So I guess, first of all, you could correct me if this is mistaken, if I misunderstood what's going on here, but also if I'm not, then I'd be happy to hear your thoughts about this kind of local, global tension, and if there are any solutions. You mentioned Denmark again. I wasn't familiar with that, but perhaps that's the way forward.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. So, and there's also this problem of technological lock-in from past innovations. So sort of this push for digitalization of healthcare in many countries has sort of locked states into spending huge amounts of money to digitalize health records. And we have to, now the current sort of governments or authorities have to justify this, and they use AI as a means to do this, or, you know, using Oracle or these big companies. And it's very difficult to develop these systems in-house. I was doing some work recently, last year, with the scientific research group on NATO, and they were saying, like, we can't develop these two AI systems in-house. Like, it's very costly. We need like a lot of experts and a lot of sort of computational power. So we have to use the private sector, which is a problem, because then you're sort of there's a relationship there that they maybe not, it's not so secure as they'd like. But so the Danish example is interesting because I think it's very much in response to Trump's sort of Greenland conversation. So the Danish population seemed to be okay with the cost and maybe the reduction in efficiency of switching systems and building up their own tech stack. But it makes sense because you don't want sort of government services run on Microsoft, for example, if you're not in the US, because it doesn't seem very, very secure or safe. There are solutions, though, because this idea that we have to use Oracle or these big companies is sort of based on this idea that we need these massive models with massive data sets, which we don't. There are other ways that we can train models. Sometimes it requires a lot of data, and that's okay, and we can have sort of shared data centers in sort of Europe. But sometimes you can use models that run on your computer with very specific data sets. And there's some interesting work on sort of indigenous data sovereignty, about how sort of indigenous communities share their data for specific projects that's used for specific means, including generative AI development. But then it stays within the community and not shared. So this is also a problem, that when the private sector, these big actors are involved, our data sort of disappears. As soon as you sort of, someone signs for this NHS data to go to Oracle, that's it. You're never getting that value back. It's gone. And I think this is a problem. So conversation on data sovereignty and digital sovereignty could sort of be useful here, I think. But we don't need massive models for everything. Like, despite what we think, it's not necessary. We're just told that it's useful because we keep buying products from the companies that sell these massive models.
Thank you so much. Now I have no more names on the list. Is there anyone? If not, thank you so much, Jason. And before you go, I want to advertise the upcoming seminars. October 22nd, Klaus Georg Hansen, Greenland 300 Years of Colonization. He's an anthropologist and filmmaker, and is also a former head of the Interior Division of the Government of Greenland. And then 5th November, Stephanie Collins from Monash University, a moral and political philosopher, will talk about interdependent responsibility for structural injustice. Yes, thank you.
Thanks.